This is the very start of the Yu-Gi-Oh card game. Hey everyone, I'm Jesse from Janjo. In this video we will be talking about Yu-Gi-Oh in 1999, the very first era of the OCG years before the game came to Western audiences. I've already discussed the early origins of the game in the TCG, and even the 1998 Bandai game before Konami got the distribution rights. But in 1999 is when the game as we know it would come to existence. It's just it was only in Japan. It all started with a simply named booster pack called Volume 1, released on February 4th, 1999. It would be the first set of the Series 1 in which this video will cover, ranging from February 1999 through March 2000. Before I start, however, I do want to mention I will be using the TCG names instead of the original OCG names, since this series is geared towards the TCG audiences, and to help gauge cards' importance by keeping the names the same for comparison's sake. But wait, there's more! Not unlike the Summon Skull promotional card of TCG's early years, the OCG also had Yu-Gi-Oh cards released a year prior in 1998. No, these were not the Bandai cards, rather they were very special promo cards to hype up the incoming card game. The first few were part of the video game Monster Capsules that was released on July 23rd, 1998. There were 10 cards and only had attack and defense, no flavor text. Then came the video game Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters, which featured 10 more cards that were more geared towards the upcoming physical game. Duel Monsters, or DM, was released in December 16, 1998, and came with 3 random cards from a 10-card set. These were considered collector's cards in holofoil rarity, and not meant for play, which should be obvious just by looking at them. The final collector's cards would be Seiryu of all cards. You could grab it at the Yu-Gi-Oh! Meeting Experience, which was an event to promote the Duel Monsters video game and subsequent OCG. Thus, these 21 silver cards were the very first Konami Yu-Gi-Oh! Cards printed as we know it. Then, February 4th, 1999 would come along, Volume 1. Volume 1 featured many cards from the original anime and manga. As typical with these early Yu-Gi-Oh! Releases, there were no effect monsters and they were quite low in attack, unlike the wild assortment in the TCG from Kagemusha to La Jin. Your boss monsters here were Dark Magician and Gaia the Fierce Knight. Yeah, for a pack with blue eyes on the cover, this Dragon of Ultimate Destruction was not even in it. Strong monsters on the other end of the spectrum would include Hitatsumi Giant, Silver Fang, and Mammoth Graveyard, thus making these cards surprisingly meta viable. Your typical strategy with Volume 1 would simply be beatdown with a little disruption here and there. Dark Hole, Fissure, and Trap Hole would be your power back row cards. Otherwise, you had equipped cards to rely on with similar decks varying on personal preference on monster types. Trust me though, it's pretty fascinating to see a format where monsters under 1000 attack had a place like Nemoriko, Dark Grey, and Kurama, not from Yu Yu Hakusho. The cards themselves look different from what we might be used to. There's much more room for attack and defense, and the text is squished in a little box. It makes sense given most of this was simply flavor text and monster effects did not exist in the game by this point. It wasn't until Series 3 with the new ruler in May 16, 2002 when the OCG would adopt the modern monster card layout. But one thing I do have to mention are the rules. While yes, the base rules are similar to the traditional rules, when the game first came out, the rules were slightly different. For one, Tribute Summoning or Advanced Summon was not a mechanic yet, meaning Dark Magician and Gaia were free play, similar to the lack of tributing in the Duel's Kingdom arc. You can also only activate one magic card or one trap per turn. There were no first turn draw nor max hand size. Your side deck could only be comprised of 10 cards. Decking out just flat out didn't exist, and to fusion summon you had to use monsters on the field, not in your hand. So you really did have to save your powerful back row cards for the boss monsters or the equipped beaters. Decks could lean towards spellcasters or beasts, but again, a lot of it was more personal preference as stat-wise the meta cards were similar coats of paint. It's not too far off to call this luck of the draw and in many ways, Baby Beatdown, for the simplicity of the game that really made it rather boring compared to the complexity of Bandai Yu-Gi-Oh! This set included many cards that, to this day, have never been printed in the TCG like Archfiend Mirror, Hourglass of Life, and the Sure. Although none of these cards mattered when it came to a very important event card. This would be Kanan the Sword Mistress, the Yu-Gi-Oh! Duel Monsters National Tournament's attendance card in which the event ran from February 1st to 21st, 99. Suddenly, the game was introduced to a monster with 1400 attack and defense, proving to be a big threat in both offensive and defensive to every other monster aside from the two big boys. Speaking of the national tournament, winners would receive very special cards made of steel, with only one copy of each card in existence, aside from replicas. They are all ritual monsters printed as normal monsters, seeing as rituals didn't exist yet. These super special awesome rare cards would be Blackluster Soldier, Zira the Mant, Super War Lion, and Fiend's Mirror. After that, it was only about a month, on March 1st to be exact, when the next set would come out in Booster 1. Booster 1 would be pretty similar in its rather limited meta-viable card pool. Important cards here would be Watkid, Ryukushin, Doron, Yamatano Dragon Scroll, Wicked Dragon with the Ursat's Head, Twin Long Rods number 1, Water Element, and Vishwar Randy. Do I make you Randy, baby? And the very first Seek card, Sinkar, and the only one, too. Also, there's Ancient Jar, the very first Jar monster. Yeah, by this point, you could probably speculate the direction of early OCG Yu-Gi-Oh! Slow, but steady. Although these cards were still no match for Kanan the Sword Waifu. Not too much later, on March 6th, we would see the starter box as a promotional piece to the Toei Yu-Gi-Oh! Movie. This set would include many strong monsters, as well as introducing field spells and fusion monsters to the game. The field spells would be the same ones we got in the Yugi Kaiba format, as well as the fusions, bar Gaia the Dragon Champion. I can't believe this introduced the highest rarity for Umi. Come on TCG, step it up. Important cards here would be Blue Eyes White Dragon, Raigeki, Polymerization, Aquamador, and Dark King of the Abyss. Anyone who pre-ordered the box would also receive Link from The Legend of Zelda. A mullet-toting swordsman from Middle-earth would be the male rival to Kanan the Sword Temptress. By the way, there's something I really like about the simplicity of this OCG Raigeki. At the end of March would be the release of Volume 2 on the 27th. Key cards in the set would include Curse of Dragon, Urabi, Monster Reborn, Swords of Revealing Light, and Dispel. Yeah, I know Reborn looks different here, as some OCG art is either sometimes being altered or changed entirely for the TCG. But you know what? I actually prefer the TCG design with the more regal look of the Ankh. By this point, power of monsters certainly has increased. After that, there was a bit of a break until late May. This might be due to Konami introducing the expert rules. This was an addition to the already established official rules, but with some quality of life changes like tribute summoning, otherwise known as sacrifice summoning, and lifting the amount of spells and traps you could use in a turn. This was a huge change that made players rethink how to run high-level monsters, which before was simply a symbol of rarity and power. Now, do you run less because they can be stuck in your hand or waste resources for it to only get destroyed? Or perhaps you play the gambit and be as aggressive as possible. Equipping lower level monsters soon became the preferred meta, although Curse of Dragon would be a popular tribute monster for its 1 tribute condition and relative high attack. At the same time, Gaia saw no play, for now he's just a worse dark magician with no real benefits. And high defense cards like Aquamador would benefit greatly, protecting you even from Curse of Dragon. This also means that Swords of Revealing Light made a big impact, for you could stall fairly well to get out strong monsters, i.e. Blue Eyes, to deal with defensive walls. Following the pattern set, Booster 2 would be the next set on May 25th, with highlights being Rogue Doll, Ukazi, Invigoration, and Sword of Dark Destruction. But it wasn't until Volume 3 when the game added a big mechanic. Yeah, we're talking effect monsters. Finally. This set was only released 2 days later from Booster 2. The first effect monsters in the game of Yu-Gi-Oh! Would be Arm Ninja, Hain, Man-Eater Bug, Skill Angel, and Reaper of the Cards. Volume 3 would also include Red Eyes Black Dragon, Stop Defense, Gravedigger Ghoul, and the very first piece of Exodia. Yeah, this was something you had to wait on playing, as each piece would get its own set. Players knew what was coming. This set would be a great pivot in the future of Yu-Gi-Oh!, and all this in only 4 months. Now you had decently strong monsters and strong equipped spells like Road Doll that, when equipped with, let's say, Elf's Light, could match Curse of Dragon's attack, just without the cost of a tribute summon. Hell, even Eurobeat with Invigoration was safer. Taking the time to tribute just wasn't as good as the more aggressive equipped beatdown strategy that required for your opponent to respond quicker. Of course, Blue Eyes was the exception here, for his incredibly high attack forced your opponent to use their removal cards. But as you might imagine, effect monsters changed the game quite nicely, as they were essentially monsters combined with the power of spells and traps. Especially with the freshman lineup, you now have monsters that can take an attack and give you an advantage, whether it was back row removal, monster destruction, bouncing back a monster, or even drawing a free card. Of course, their drawback was their low stats. Their utility was still very much useful. These effect monsters would specifically be known as flip effect monsters or reverse monsters, for the requirement of having to be flipped face up to trigger their respective effect. And now with these sneaky new monsters, choice of using certain monsters was introduced to the game over a simple power struggle, as well as having to think more critically. Do you summon that Blue Eyes to only be destroyed by a Man-Eater? Then you'd be out even more resources had you decided to play Curse instead. What if the set monster was an Aqua Medor? You couldn't tell. This also further increased the usefulness of Swords of Revealing Light and made Stop Defense a great strategy as well. Needless to say, effect monsters, or flip monsters in this case, would greatly change the mindset and strategy that would essentially become the mainstay Yu-Gi-Oh! Playstyle for many, many years. Volume 3 would also introduce another very powerful and impact card, Pot of Greed. Yeah, we all know what it does, but for those who don't, it lets you draw 2 cards. Simple, effective, Bliss. A card that has a contention of many players. This greedy Voss allowed you to gain unconditional advantage, unconditional love. If you don't have this card in your deck, well, then you're just a third-rate duelist with a fourth-rate deck. Remember, in this era of Yu-Gi-Oh!, aside from Skill Angel, gaining advantage wasn't really a thing, so greed was like a bomb dropping for cold, hard draw power. There are 2 more cards I want to quickly mention from this groundbreaking Volume 3. Gravedigger Ghoul, as it introduced the concept of a banish zone. That must have been a pretty weird idea to grasp. And the other card being Sandstone, as it showed that even early OCG didn't shy away from introducing figuratively unplayable cards. Booster 3 on July 5th would give us reinforcements and Ultimate Offering with this distinct OCG art. Hourglass of Courage wasn't too bad either, since it could potentially double its attack. And Beautiful Headhuntress and Great White continued not bad attack monsters. 3 days later, the Game Boy Color game Duel Monsters 2 would come out with a slew of promotional cards. By this point, we've seen other promotional cards like Millennium Shield, however, it was this game that sent down the heavy hitters. Top 3 cards being Kunai with Chain, a multifunctional trap for mode switching or an attack boost, or both. Harpy's Feather Duster, a back row version of Raigeki, destroying all your opponent's spells and traps on the field. And Crush Card Virus, a trap that nukes your opponent's field of strong monsters and all further strong monsters they draw for 3 turns. Whoa, talk about overpowered. Then Volume 4 gave us Harpy Lady, Summon Skull, and Magician of Faith. Skull was revolutionary in his high attack and low tribute cost. This also made breaking through defensive monsters that much easier, and suddenly advanced monsters were viable again. Even Blue Eyes was pushed back to the sidelines because of Skull's usefulness. And with the addition of Faith, now you could recur Pot of Greed, which, needless to say, is not half bad. On the same date as Booster 4, August 26, the premium pack came out with the final piece of Exodia. Now, a new win condition was achievable, and with the access to unlimited Exodia pieces and Pot of Greed, as well as a slew of other cards and ones to come. Exodia would be quite the threatening deck had you acquire all the needed meta cards. But since the pieces of Exodia were already so hard to come by, it wasn't like everyone played it back in the day. By the way, this event with the pack was Dark Duel Stories' Duelist Legend in the Tokyo Dome tournament. Prize cards here were 3 Firewing Pegasus, 2 Meteor Black Dragon, and 1 Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon for the champion. Trihorn Dragon was a participation card. Ultimate Dragon was put up in an auction in 2012 and sold for over $10,000. Insane. There were limited or restricted cards where there was one of each of these cards per deck, but the thing was that there's no concrete evidence on it. The most likely time of a limited list was for the August 26, 99 national tournament, with the cards being Raigeki, Trap Hole, and Dark Hole. See, there are many local rules around Japan in 99 Yu-Gi-Oh, and information for official rules are tough to come by, so we have to go off what little we can find and research from various Yu-Gi-Oh historians. Booster 4 is when things kicked up a notch with very powerful low-level monsters like Axe Raider, La Jin, Mechanical Chaser, Gemini Elf, and even introducing Graceful Charity. This really was the mecca of strong normal summon monsters. An inflation of power? Perhaps. Think about seeing Gemini Elf for the first time and seeing that the game of Yu-Gi-Oh couldn't have possibly gone any greater heights than this. Was this the end? Even consider the appearance of Graceful Charity, a new draw power card that is arguably better than Pot of Greed. Draw 3 cards and discard 2. You gain an additional card than Pot, the drawback of deciding which one you kept. And you could combine its use with a revival card like Monster Reborn to dump and bring back a Blue Eyes or Summon Skull. Graveyard play was now a thing. There were definitely signs of a balance collapse given the quick incursion of power. If you didn't have these strong monsters and draw spells, you were at a serious disadvantage, more than ever before. How would the game recover from here? Of course, the game continued with the following Volume 5, would introduce other powerful cards as we all know and love, like Change of Heart. With the amount of cards released by this point, you at least had more freedom to build your deck even if the low-rank attackers and draw power reached a new time high. Mass Sorcerer in Volume 5 introduced non-flip effect monsters and was a good card by his decent ability and not abysmal stats. Change of Heart was a huge card. I mean, of course it is. Take control of an opponent's monster for a turn, chibi that monster or attack with them, whether it was a Gemini Elf or their own Summon Skull, or their flip effect monster and gain their effect for yourself. You could call this offensive removal. Tribute to the Doomed was more destruction that was appreciated as it had more of a choice for destruction than Fissure. And then Magician of Faith could just bring back all these powerful spell cards. Next was Booster 5 that had even more powerful cards like Needle Worm, a deck scraping card where, when flipped, sends the top 5 cards of your opponent's deck to the graveyard. Birth of the Deck Destruction deck. Yeah, decking out your opponent was now an option thanks to this purple insect. This style would be fully realized in the later Form Empty Jar deck. And then we have Morphing Jar. This monstrous pot, when flipped, makes both players discard their hand and then draw 5 more cards. More fuel to the deck out strategy. But it's also good for pure hand replenishment if you're needing cards. Oral Decree was also in Booster 5 and it negated all traps on the field. Volume 6 would introduce Counter Traps, which was another big meta shit with Horn of Heaven, Magic Jammer, 7 Tools of the Bandit, and Solemn Judgment. Though you'd never know by looking, as the Counter Trap symbol was not present on cards at the time. Actually, neither were any spell or trap variations. These cards brought reactionary negation to the game, and Solemn Judgment with its effect to negate everything became one of the strongest cards in the game's history for this. While going aggro on your opponent was the play, interfering your opponent's play soon took over the game plan, as decks would find balance and timing to be key. Although not many people played Judgment for many years because of the high life point cost was deemed too steep. Volume 6 would also give us 2 other strong cards in 2 Searchers, Witch of the Black Forest, and Sangan. By this point, that being November 18th, 1999, the game as we know it is starting to look more like we know it within the span of not even a full year. Each card searched either offensive or defensive cards that fit the specific criteria. It's important to note that rulings back in 99 ruled that these monsters gain their effects regardless of how they reach the graveyard, meaning Graceful Charity would trigger them. They would help the game continue to its wait-and-see mentality, as you could play and search for specific monsters that helped you in the best of specific scenarios. It started the trend of monsters that gain advantage upon removal, and thus the threshold of backfiring was not high. Like with Witch of the Black Forest, you could search Gemini Elf, Summon Skull, or even Muka Muka. Sangan could even be used as a medium for Crush Card. Oh, and both of them could search Exodia pieces. But with Needleworm and Morphing Jar existing now, Exodia still had hurdles to jump through, forcing it to adopt strategies like Solemn Judgment. But the final set of 1999 would be Booster 6, and that would be the set to introduce players to many new fusion supports. Goddess of the Third Eye was also in the set, which began the line of fusion substitute monsters. We also got even more fusion support in Fusion Sage and Monster Eye. Next we got Cyberstein, which summoned a fusion monster at a high cost. Despite paying 5,000 life points and putting yourself in the danger zone, now special summoning strong monsters was a real threat. Instant firepower. Because in Series 2, you could summon Blue Eyes Ultimate and equip it with Megamorph for potentially a one-hit KO. You even had Gale Dogra that could be used in a combo with Monster Reborn before Series 2 introduced a revival rule for monsters that had to be special summoned a certain way. On December 9th, a new Yu-Gi-Oh! Video game would come out with promos. Yu-Gi-Oh! True Dual Monsters Sealed Memories. Look familiar? Two cards of interest here are Metalmorph as a not half bad attacking trap, and Metal Zoa, which was a monster that their summoning effect could be activated from the deck, which was incredibly uncommon. Though the final set would be the EX Starter Box released on December 16th, which would feature the first starter decks in the OCG and would be reworked into the TCG's Yugi and Kaiba starter decks in 2002. Many great cards like Giant Soldier of Stone and Dark Hole were reprinted, a great collection for beginners. It also brought forth Wabaku and Last Will into the fray. Since Volume 6 gave us Cannon Soldier, using his effect to send monsters to the graveyard for burn damage could not only trigger Sangan to search, but Last Will to summon out another monster for even more burn and continuous searching. Exodia, anybody? With a lengthy and groundbreaking 1999, Yu-Gi-Oh! Would enter the new millennium. There would only be 2 more sets in 2000 to end the Series 1. Volume 7, released on January 27, 2000, would be the final volume set. Key cards here are Thunder Dragon, Karibo, Dark Elf, DD Warrior, and a beautiful Mirror Force. Many cards now went different directions, from fusions to beatdowns to Exodia. Thunder Dragon was used for hand costs like Tribute to the Doomed or Graceful Charity, or perhaps more simply for Twin-Headed Thunder Dragon for some more aggressive plays. Mirror Force is the trap card to flip on your opponent if there ever were one, destroying all their attacking monsters in a cathartic "ha, I got you," the biggest removal for a trap card at that time. Dark Elf gave you a high attack, but at a life point cost for attacking. The choice was yours. DD Warrior could remove itself and the monster battling with it from play, making it removal that dodged around Monster Reborn and the Searchers. Karibo would introduce the now called hand trap mechanic, where an effect activates from your hand. And then, a little after 1 year of the OCG game on March 1st, Booster 7, the final set of the Series 1, was released. The biggest cards to come from the set were Jirai Gumo and Heavy Storm. Jirai Gumo was similar to Dark Elf and a monster with a disadvantaged attacker. It's like if Solemn Judgment could punch, and was a giant hideous spider.
Why won't you love me, Dad?
Considering you could possibly lose half your life points on a coin flip, Dark Elf was typically the preferred high attack beater. Try not to trip over these cards, but players who understood a thing or two tended to stray away from these monsters in favor of a more reliable and still decent Gemini Elf. Dream Clown was a new kind of effect monster that gained its effect when switching positions. Heavy Storm, however, was the MVP of the OCG in Booster 7. Destroys all spells and traps on the field. Sure, it was weaker than Feather Duster, but its power still tested true as a heavy hitter. Crazy to think that both these cards existed before Mystical Space Typhoon, which was a single target back row hate. Actually, quick play spells didn't even exist yet and won't be until Magic Ruler in the following April. But before that, in March 23rd, was the Dark Ceremony pack. It's kind of like a premium pack, but not really. This pack contained only 16 cards, albeit all super rares. While ritual monsters were introduced in the first premium pack back in the previous December, this one re-released them with a few more rituals. But rituals weren't really competitive in any way, shape, or form, and was mostly collected for collection's sake. This would be the last release of what's known as Series 1. Series 2 would follow with a familiar set in Magic Ruler and a limited list featuring cards like Mirror Force, Exodia, and Raigeki, among other card effect erratas like with Sangan and Witch, ultimately adjusting the quality of life changes that was much needed by this point. The rest, as they say, would be history. I don't know if going over all this would be dull, but it is important to see where all our favorite and impact cards came from initially before they were imported to other regions. Wording was also weird, like how Trap Hole included self-destruction text because otherwise the rules never mentions the card getting sent to the graveyard. Could you imagine that? A continuous Trap Hole? Does Raigeki destroy all your opponent's monsters in the deck as well? It also allows us to see how deck building would have been done at the time. Mostly power decks in descending order, at least before effect monsters became a thing. Equip Beatdown was a popular deck as power creep naturally occurred with monsters like Gemini Elf, DD Warrior, and Sangan. Even Exodia at one point was very scary when every card was unlimited. Could you imagine the TCG introducing other cards in The Legend of Blue Eyes at the start, like Skull Angel, Gemini Elf, or hell, even Solemn Judgment? Just seeing the evolution of such a complex game from its infancy, taking baby steps throughout the span of roughly a year, researching and writing this took way longer than I initially had planned. At first, I was going to make a video on Volume 1 and another at the tail end of Series 1. My rough draft script was a basic, here's a pack and some cards. 1999 OCG Yu-Gi-Oh! Demanded more in-depth dissection than that. It wasn't just about the contents of the booster packs, it was why those cards were added and how it changed the game up to that point that made early Yu-Gi-Oh! So historically rich and important to jot down. Because again, there's not too many resources out there otherwise. The OCG Archives Discord was a great help, and YuGioHistory.com was really the treasure trove that I needed to absorb, niche, and form into this Yu-Gi-Oh! History entry. I knew I wanted to talk about all this eventually, but I had no clue it would wind up like this, which I'm actually very much happy to have done. I don't think I'll tackle any more older OCG content, as the rest is just kind of pre-release TCG stuff. So with that said, it's time to move on to one of the most popular years in Yu-Gi-Oh's illustrious history, 2005.